one at a time too, so probably like
wander in.
rolling and
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for coming on this beautiful day and during Pride Month. I am extremely honored that Mel suggested this, that Allie invited me, that Brian organized things too. And I just think it's so cool that the library is doing this week of events. And so yeah, I'm really grateful to be a part of it. And I just think it's like a really important opportunity for us to come together as a community. And when Mel and I were kind of talking about what I could do, we were like, let's talk about movies. Partly because, I don't know if you've noticed, things have been a little bleak lately. And so I thought it might be fun for us to talk about one of my great pleasures, which is cinema. So anyway, just to briefly introduce myself. Oh, we've moved forward. I don't know how that happened. My name is Teagan Bradway. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a professor of English over at SUNY Cortland. And I'll say a little bit more about myself, but in the advertisement for this event, I did promise that we would talk at some point about the first gay film, and it's been playing for the last like 30 minutes. Are you scandalized? How shocked are you? You didn't even notice. This is so intense and subversive. So there is a long debate about what is or is not the first queer film, and we'll get into why there is a debate about this, but many people point to this, which is from either 1894 or 1895. It's hard to pinpoint it. It's from the William Dixon experiment. He helped to innovate a number of the early cinema techniques, and specifically this is arguably the very first sound film. And so I don't have the sound for it. But so this, you can see here, is the thing that's recording the sound. And there have been many different titles, but the title under which it traveled was The Gay Brothers. Yeah, we'll talk a bit about the film in a second, but I just thought I would explain why this has been playing the whole time. It's not just for funsies. But anyway, so a little bit about who I am. I already mentioned I teach at SUNY Cortland. I teach courses on LGBTQ literature. I teach queer horror. I teach intro to film. And I do a lot of work on queer and trans theory. That's what my research is primarily on. And these are some of the books that I've recently published. And the one question that drives a lot of my work is about how queer people form attachments. How do we bond to one another? How do we bond to objects, to texts? And so the first book that I wrote on queer experimental literature was all about how queers read in different ways, and in ways that literary studies doesn't always acknowledge or doesn't feel comfortable with. And so in my field in literary studies, the main thing that we're always telling students is to be critical, to be objective, look for the evidence, stop fantasizing, stop reading with your body, stop getting lost in the text. And for me, as a queer reader, like that was so important to the way that I related to text. So I was really interested in tracing a genealogy of how queer people had read in ways that signified as bad, that were not sanctioned or approved. And so my more recent work has been on how those similar forming of attachments shape our families, our friendships. And so one of the things that I was hoping we could talk about is how it shapes our relationships to film. But before we get to film, let me just say a little bit about what queer theory is, in case this is your very first time ever hearing this phrase or this term, and maybe this will give a bit of a sense of why it's so important to me, why I wanted to write books about it. So queer theory arises in the 1980s in English departments. It builds on feminism, gay and lesbian studies, and black studies in particular. But it challenges them in a big way. And it was extremely controversial at the time. You can go back to like 1991 New York Times articles, and they're all like scandalized by what's happening in English departments. We as English professors dream to go back to those days when we were relevant. But nonetheless, one of the big things that queer theory was doing was trying to bring politics and activism into the classroom. So that was one reason why it was so controversial. And the second thing that it was doing was saying, we're not just interested in recovering queer people. So gay and lesbian studies, sort of from the 1970s up until the late 80s, was about sort of finding gay and lesbian people in the past and recovering them. So, and you can even find books like this in the library today. It's like Shakespeare is gay in the way that we are gay, or like Sappho is a lesbian in the way that we are a lesbian, something like that. That's what gay and lesbian studies was about. And you can imagine why that was important, right? It's like people say you don't exist, they're trying to erase your existence, you're trying to build an archive of your validity. But queer theory came along and said, like, are we though? Are we gay in the same way that Shakespeare was gay? Like, are we, you know, imagining lesbianism in the same way that Sappho is? Should we imagine that our ideas about identity in particular are transhistorical, that they're essential? Should we also imagine that identity is a good thing, which is something that gay and lesbian studies had sort of accepted? So queer theory comes along and says, we're more interested in queer as a verb, queer as a doing. And they really wanted us to think about how gender, race, sexuality are socially constructed through cultural and political norms. And so what that means is that we have to become really adept readers. We have to read between the lines for how power and society constructs us as human beings, how it normalizes particular kinds of identities or ways in the world. Anyway, I always love this illustration because I feel like it's a great encapsulation of what queer theory does, which is sort of refuse the terms of how we think about gender. And one thing, I don't know if you've noticed, are you a boy or a girl isn't even posed as a question, it's just a period here. And so it's sort of a refusal to the entire premise that one would need to have a gender, or that you know, gender could be stabilized by a binary. At the time, we didn't have the language of non-binary so much. I mean, it was the language being more genderqueer or queerness itself. And so that's something we'll talk about, is how queer theory has opened up new possibilities for thinking about gender, but also the culture has moved forward in really powerful and enabling ways. So what does any of this have to do with film? Like, how can queer theory help us think about film studies? Well, the first thing is we want to think about how the history of sexuality and the history of cinema are fundamentally intertwined. And that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later on. But what that means is that, like, legally, economically, culturally, medically, all of the fields that have defined what we think of as gender and sexuality are also represented in cinema. They're also a part of the same material production of film. And so queer theory and queer film studies are really interested in seeing how those things are bound up with one another. How, especially, cinema has shaped what we think of as reality. And one thing I want you to start thinking about right now is, like, the films that shape your own sense of identity, your own sense of reality, your own sense of possibility in the world. Because for queer theorists, cinema is always a scene of visual desire. We're sitting there, it used to be in a dark room, it might now be on your phone, you know, but you're staring, you get, one of the things I love queer film studies says is sort of like cinema and the image is one of the places where it's like socially acceptable to stare for lengthy periods of time at somebody who doesn't know that you're looking at them. You know, of course, we've got Marlene Dietrich looking back at us, but there is a spark of desire in the image. And so that's something that's deeply important. And then the last thing, this is probably the most controversial, is that there's no firm binary for queer film studies between straight and queer cinema. So to go back to this example of the first gay film, you can see here now the problem that we have. If we want to say it's the first gay film, then we would have to sort of be like, okay, so these two dudes are gay, and that's why they're dancing, and that's what that means, right? But of course, this is an ongoing debate. Like, was it the case that they just wanted to prove that sound film has, you know, a particular, you know, auditory quality, and so we need to demonstrate that in the image? So there are two scientists figuring out sound design, and it's like, well, you guys dance now. Like, because of course, sexism, you're not hiring a lot of women in the workplace, right? Was that part of what was going on? At the same time, lots of people have pointed out, even though the concept of the homosexual is coined around 1870, it's still so early in the sort of shaping of what we think of as a homosexual. So in that time, before we sort of solidified what gayness is in our modern sense, gender norms were really different. So you had homoeroticism, you had male friendships and sociality in ways that were a lot more intimate. So that's why it's hard for us to stabilize and say yes or no, it is or is not gay, But for me, I would say there's queerness in this. And perhaps some of the undecidability here is what makes it a bit queer. So if it's true that cinema is a scene of desire and that it shapes reality, let's pause and chat for a minute about what films or TV shows or media or anime or comics or games or whatever, what was meaningful to you? And I'm curious, like, what resonated in particular in that media, in that film for you and for your friends. I picked, for me, I saw The TV Glow, which I don't know if you've seen. You haven't seen it yet? Oh my God, is there a friendship over? Do you hate trans people? You're kidding. Of course you do. No. So this film was deeply important to me. It came out like last year, and it was about like a year, a little more into my own transition, and I went to go see it not having any idea that it had anything to do with transness, and the movie hit the credits and I was like weeping in the theater, and so I went back the very next day, like by myself. And I was like, I'm gonna watch it again. So that's a movie that's like really, really stuck with me, and part of the reason it resonated is it's not only about the struggle to imagine that one can embrace a different reality or a different self, but also it's a film about people's relationship to media, to pop culture, and so they're obsessed with a Buffy-esque television show, and so I really love how the film is sort of doubled. It's like about how they work out their desires through their relationship to the show. So anyway, what are some of yours? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I discovered Velvet Goldmine when I was living in rural Kentucky in the late 90s. And Velvet Goldmine introduced me to Oscar Wilde and not introduced me to David, but added a dimension to the David Bowie love I already had. And it was about such bisexual longing. Yes. And like, is there anything more precious in this world?
Do you remember like where or when you first saw it, like the context?
I drove 45 minutes from my tiny town to a video store that had it at the nearest college town to where I grew up, which is Moorhead, Kentucky. And I must have gone 3 times to that video store to rent this movie. And I kept showing it to friends, and friends' parents kept coming in at the naked scene.
That's his classic.
And like everyone has seen Ewan McGregor just naked.
Yep.
Like that's what we do in the 90s. And I had to share it. I had to get the soundtrack. It was a placebo, and like one thing led to another thing led to another thing, and this wonderful glittery joy thing. And I started wearing glitter on my face every day for the rest of high school.
Oh, that is beautiful. Thank you for sharing that one. That is such a beautiful example. Anybody else? Sure.
I honestly haven't seen as much queer cinema and TV as I would like to, so I'm taking notes of titles here. But one that did really mean a lot for me is the TV show Sense8.
Oh yeah.
Not just for the like gender and sexuality representation in it, but more so just it being about connectiveness and kind of all of the little things that get in the way of people coming together kind of melting away was really powerful.
Have you rewatched it?
I did a couple of years ago at this point, yeah.
What was the experience watching it a second time? I'm curious. Did it change? Did you discover something else? Like, what happened?
It reinforced that I didn't care for the main plot.
Say more, a little bit more. Yeah.
I mean, I love the characters and their connection, but the main, there's a bad guy doing stuff, I don't care about that part of the plot. But it was neat watching it from the start, kind of knowing where things end up a little bit and seeing more of the connections early on, certainly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, anybody else got a movie you got or a film? Yeah.
It's really subtle but paranormal. It's not that subtle, but like it's not a main plot point, it's not da-da-da.
Yes,
but
yes,
being in the theater at like age 11 and having like I have queer family members. It wasn't like taboo in my household, but that was the first time that it was like, oh, you're gonna love my boyfriend, being said by a male character, this big, beefy soccer sports man. I was like, wow, that's great. Like, and I remember sitting in the theater and nobody laughed. Everybody just went, aww. So, and that was big for me as little 11-year-old me.
Yeah. And I'm curious, have you watched it since? Is it a touchstone like it is for Meredith and Val, or is it in the past for you?
I love stop motion, so I rewatch Leica movies all the time, but I'm not necessarily watching it for that moment. I'm watching it for the love of the art.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Anybody else got a movie to share? Yes.
I have a show.
It counts.
It counts as a show. and maybe not something that people, I see now. That people think of as like, oh, this is like queer canon type stuff. But for me, it felt very queer, and that's Twin Peaks.
Oh yeah, totally.
Go on.
So,
Say.
So I was in high school. I was in 9th grade, and the minute it came on, that opening with the waterfall and Julie cruising and stuff, I felt like I was in a trance. I felt like this was something that was just for me. Even though I was watching it with like all my friends.
Yeah.
But even though a lot of like hetero relationships are on, it's the friendships that felt super queer to me. And I was in love with Sherilyn Fenn because she was Audrey was the hottest. And but like Cooper and the sheriff, Truman, right?
Yeah.
Their friendships were so. And then Catherine Martell and Josie, like there was so much gayness happening, and I was like 14, and I'm like, ooh, I don't know, I like it. and it's something I've probably every few years go back and watch, and I see new things that I didn't notice before, within like the relationships with people.
Yeah.
My favorite, I think that when I was younger, I was like, oh, Cooper and this and that. But as an older adult now, the relationship between Big Ed and Norma is so, it feels queer coded to me, but also it feels so real and just touching. Like there's something about it.
Yeah.
But like everything there. I'm like gay, queer. And David Lynch must have known. I mean, if David Lynch didn't know Mark Frost sure did. But they created the queerest world of all.
David Duchovny's character.
Oh, how did I forget it? Yeah. Denise, right?
Yeah.
And then when they, and you know, I love that in the return, he put in that little thing with like, you know, fix your heart or die.
Yes.
All you clown comics, fix your heart or die. And he tried to write that because, you know, going back and watching it, that was something that was not the way it was portrayed, but he really tried. And, but like, there's so much, and just like the Andy, the dumb sheriff, like everybody in it. I'm like, there's the football players, and then Laura, the flashbacks with Laura and her friends, like hard.
When you're watching it, you're 14.
I'm 14.
You're caught by the gay vibes. Did you have a language for it? How did you understand what you were experiencing? I'm curious.
I don't think I had a language for it. I knew something was different. I don't think I had a language, but I could not wait to get to school to talk to my other friends that watched it, who in hindsight, I'm like, oh, they were probably also queer. Some of them are. Because I knew it was something special for us because it was the kind of show that you talk to people about it, they'd go, oh no, too weird, I can't watch that show. And that was like immediately, I can't be friends with you. You're boring. Yeah, it was that kind of thing. But it was like a connector.
Right.
And kind of like, I know we've talked about horror. Like this in the same way, because there were some scary scenes in Twin Peaks. Bob, the first time Bob pops up. Bob, who was just happened to be working on a set, and David Lynch was like, I think the lighting, you could do this. And I've seen interviews with that guy and him speaking, his speaking voice. I'm like, I can't believe that guy scared us. Because he's like, girl, you know, I just don't know. And I'm like, oh my God, is he gay? I remember seeing an interview like around 2000, and I was like, but he passed away, I want to say in the late 90s.
But then, like Bob and the shoe salesman.
Oh, yeah.
We can talk all day about
No,
this.
but they had a very queer cast as well. But like,
our next program is just gonna be about Twin Peaks.
great for
I'm
that.
here. I'm here for it.
I
I'll be there.
I feel like we're hitting on one of these things of like I feel like Sensei did a really great job with this too, of like the othering of even people that are just closer, even if they're like hetero or whatever, like that we're going back to this other time, maybe when this film was made, but like all these expectations, I think was like a lot more blurred and not so segmented, right? I feel like that's when we feel like we're, at least for me, when I watch all these things and references, like I felt like I was stepping into that space, where the expectations were a little different.
Yeah. Which I think is like, it's a really complex point too, because I often have students who are like 18 and are like, having an identity, having a legible, clear box is deeply important, and of course it is. Like, I needed that too. And then on the other hand, there is something very important about the fuzziness and the what can happen in a kind of more ambiguous atmosphere. But I'm loving in the example that you gave us, Woody, it became a way of deciding who you were going to be friends with in a way,
I mean,
which is just
I didn't pick anybody on my friend.
No. But I mean, I think. But I really do think, like, films, media, and these other things become a kind of relational touchstone, right? Sure. It's a way that you build community. That's why I love your example of Sense8 as well, which is like about a bunch of people who are rather different, but trying to find a way to stay connected. And then also, I mean, Meredith, in your example, it's like the film comes off the screen literally onto your body, right? With the glitter on your face. And there's something about the blurring of the line between the art object and reality that's really. Anybody else got one you want to share before we move on? Yes, please.
It's cliche Steven Universe. So the finale of the series came out right when I was trying to come out to my parents.
Yeah.
So the scene of Steven being split from himself and screaming that he's not the person who they want him to be, I'm kind of bad enough. Just hit home, them oh, I actually have to come out to my family at some point.
Yeah.
And it was really fortunate and painful timing at the same time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm curious if you want to say more about because you said, oh, it's cliche, but what was that? What's that about? Because I feel like there's something really important in that caveat.
Yeah. I just feel like
I got you.
The overall viewpoint of Steven Universe has changed in recent years.
Yes.
Where when it came out, it's this really important thing, and then over time people are kind of stepping back from it to kind of be oh, it's actually really not that all that. But there is a new series coming out, so maybe it'll change that.
Part of it, I'm so glad that you elaborated on that, because I feel like that's an experience that's very central to a lot of queer, trans, broadly queer defined relationships to cultural objects that we attach to that we needed. Things change, people's attitudes change, and what was a touchstone for our generation or for me can become problematic. For example, I mean, it was interesting to hear it a bit in Woody where you're now the trans representation wasn't great, but then they fixed it later, right? And I was like,
and I don't even know that they fixed it, but
well, you know what I mean.
They commented.
Acknowledge that we didn't handle that right, and so here's what we're going to try to do. Thanks, David Lynch.
But I think that, go ahead, yeah.
I was just gonna say, but it's so important to keep space for ourselves with those things that helped us to the past. One of my first things was going completely in drag for the first time when I was 16 or 17. Rocky Horror, right? When I was in high school, ultimate, because exactly. But there's so many people that those younger siblings are well, that's really problematic. It's but if we didn't have that, then. It's funny, how do we create these spaces where we're gonna hold these things that we had, because that's all we had at the time,
right? And
still continue to move on and not just leave all this stuff in the dust that was so important to get us to where we are now.
I have a Rocky Horror slide coming up.
Oh.
I was very much, oh, this is gonna be a room filled with 13-year-old queers, and I'm gonna convince them, and anyway, so, but just imagine yourself. But I think Rocky Horror is a really interesting example of that too, because every year it seems to come up as the new problematic one or the new one that the culture has moved on in some way, and it produces really interesting and complex conversations for us about what we want going forward. But on the other hand, I don't want to live in a world where we deny those objects as somehow other or bad or whatever. if you've seen the film Disclosure, which is a lot about the history of trans representation in cinema, people talk a lot about their complex relationships to Silence of the Lambs, for example.
Yes, sure.
And I always, whenever I show that film in my film classes, students are always like, "Oh, are we allowed to like this?" And I'm like, "Yes." But we got to talk about why. Anybody else got a piece of media you want to share or talk about before we move forward? This is your time. Yeah.
I'll name one. I don't have much of a story, but it's obvious. Like, the Butter and Cheerleader was a big one.
Yeah.
Because when I saw it, I was in I don't know, maybe 9th grade, and I was like, these were high school kids, like me. And I think that's when I was like, oh, okay, this is a possibility. And then I remember like a couple years later, I was like, I showed my mom. And I more remember that memory of watching it with her than I do like the first time I saw it.
Okay,
So.
tell us about what that was like. What was that? Did you put the VHS in? Were you watching her while she watched it?
It was a VHS.
Was it?
Yeah.
a
Probably was.
It must have been.
Because it didn't come out in 2000, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
my mom did not get a DVD player until like 2010. So.
Whoa.
She may still not.
Yeah, no, I was very excited to show her this movie because I was also like very excited to show her a movie where like gay people don't die in the end.
Yes.
Because that was
They
a lot
exist.
of like the movies that were around
Yes.
when I was a teen, and it was like, oh look, they're happy in the end. Like what? And I was like, Mom, that's Paul. Like I was just very excited to show her one of the days, and she was more open to it at the time than when I had seen it, like without her knowing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm curious, did you show your family the Steven Universe episode or not? Or were they there?
I'm sure they were there. We all kind of shared the same TV.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was nice because like she was watching like The Good Doctor, and like I remember like specifically there was an episode about like a trans person that like wasn't actually trans, and like it was just like
Classic.
the worst. It's like all the TV around that era.
Yeah.
Not
So
great.
No, so I was watching that, I was like scared to come out, and then I actually had a good representation. I was like, oh, look at this, like it's actually not all like crime procedural.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Man, that is so interesting to think about the scene of, not just the scene of coming out, but like the scene of showing something or watching something as a way towards coming out. I often talk with my students about in queer literature, most many scenes of coming out are in like cars or in other spaces where a person, okay, this clearly resonates for some, or other places where a person cannot exit the situation or the scenario. But it's interesting now to think about the watching of a film as a similar, I mean, now we pause them every 5 seconds to look at our phones, but at the time, when we had attention spans, you were sort of held wrapped. Mel, did you want to share? I thought you might.
Oh, I was going to say, this is going to sound very cliche, but Xena the Princess Warrior.
Yes.
And I want to say not because of her relationship with clearly her girlfriend, but just Xena being so strong, but so feminine.
Yeah.
And I was like, do I have to be gay to be like that? Or can I just be like that? That's a thing we can do? Like, I could punch into it and still be like, yeah,
Oh, that's a beautiful example, and also a great example to bring us back to the question not only of sexuality but gender, right? And gender is a kind of not only an identity but a certain you want it to be a certain kind of femininity, right? I'm just curious, did you notice any patterns from the examples that came up, either like genres? I'm really fascinated by the different genres, or touchstones, or just anything commonalities that you noticed over the course of the last few minutes.
Fantasy takes a certain realm, Steven Universe, horror, Xena, I mean, even like, the true, not true story of, of a place where we're sort of like taking a step away from
Yeah.
the rules.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's absolutely, I mean, it's always interesting to me which countries have outlawed or censored science fiction and fantasy. There are a number of nations that have done this, and part of that is precisely because we don't want to promote genres where people could imagine that things could be otherwise, right? And like, you get to play potentially in the rules of sci-fi and fantasy, or any other patterns you notice? That's a great point.
in the margins or mentions in the margins, like the paranorma. And I think that a lot of us that grew up queer, we're like, okay, well, our story's not the main story. Where are we gonna find it? Is it gonna be a villain? Is it gonna be a hinge? Is it gonna be a sidekick?
Right, because it's never gonna be the hero, right?
Yeah.
It's always gonna be.
Are you gonna be oddly fascinated with the 3 identical blonde women that follow Miss Dawn around?
Okay, I'll see. Tell us more.
I want to see what they do when there's no one else around.
Oh my God, it's like, I didn't tell you, but you just set us up perfectly for the Disney slide of it all. But I mean, first, I think absolutely part of what you're talking about is like queer desire can come from surprising objects, but also from surprising places within those, right? Like nobody said Beauty and the Beast, and yet here we are, and recognizing it instantly, right? I think, you know, this is maybe obvious, but what counts as queer changes over time. I mean, I think that I don't know fully, but like we seem to share some generational touchstones. But I imagine if we like had a full cross-section of Ithaca's queer community, then there would be a wider gap. And it would be interesting to reflect on which ones mattered and which ones don't translate across. But what I think is super interesting, and the thing that I really want to stress, is that reception matters just as much as representation. And so whether or not one would say Steven Universe is or is not a representation of X, the reception of it mattered, right? In the same way that what you said, Val, about Sense8 is, it's like going back, rewatching it, the main plot, you're like, I got it, like whatever, right? It's yours.
There's some action scenes.
The orgy scene, though, pretty great.
Never forget.
But the reception, how you read it, how you relate to it, that matters just as much. And then, as I've already mentioned, problematic text can still matter profoundly to us. And I think that that's something that we're in a moment where that's still difficult for folks to accept. And maybe we can come back to that in the end and think about what that means. Of course, I put Bugs Bunny, trans icon, as an example of this. So what I thought I would do now is shift us forward. I was like, I'm not going to do the whole history of queer cinema. I couldn't do it, but I thought maybe I could just dip us into 4 key scenes, key moments that I think are worth talking about. And then in case you want to go watch some for Pride Month, you can head off onto it. But if you are super interested in the history of queer and trans cinema, these are essential watching. The Celluloid Closet on the left, and also the book that it's based on is just really incredible. And Disclosure, which for a while was on Netflix, it probably still is.
It might still be. I think Netflix put it out. Also, if you have a DVD player and you can't find the Celluloid Closet, we have a copy of it here at the library.
It's amazing, and I kind of think of Disclosure as like a sequel, or a, you know, it's in that vein. And there, anyway, about the representation of queerness and transness over time. So these are the moments we're going to hit. So first things first, let's talk about queer coding, which is a term that already came up in the room beautifully, and it's one that we're often very familiar with, but the backstory to it, just in case you don't know, is that up until about 1934, we're in the pre-code era. So we've got silent cinema, and then really, you know, into our black and whites, and we've got, up until 1934, pretty scandalous, intense, offensive, sexual, erotic cinema. We've got our first gay kiss in Wings or Morocco, first lesbian kiss. Again, I'm all about the Marlene Dietrich gender bending here. And so, I mean, in these films, you've got all kinds of interesting things that would later become censored. Sex, drugs, violence, and especially gender transgression. And one of the things to know is that when queerness was being medically defined, if you've ever wondered, like, why is it that people seem to get queerness and transness so confused? One argument would be is that from the very beginning they were bound up. And especially if you go with the sort of way they were constructed politically and medically, in this historical moment, to be gay is to be born in the wrong body, right? So like to be a gay man was to be a woman born in a man's body, right? Now that would become more of a trans narrative, but at the time those were totally and utterly blurry, right? For better and for worse. But so one of the things that's interesting then is a lot of the ways that you're going to find queerness in these films is through the kind of gender bending. And so that's an interesting problem for queer reading. Is like, well, do I read this in a kind of trans way? Do I read it in a kind of gay way? Like, how do I read it? But as we said, queer studies would be more interested in the blurriness, not so much sorting that out. But once the Hays Code comes into effect, 1934, up through the 60s, it starts to taper off. But it's heavy in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You have severe and serious censorship at all levels, especially in Hollywood production. But not only in Hollywood, I mean, if we were to talk about pre-code films in Weimar, Germany, for example, there were incredible representations of transness that were then destroyed by the Nazis, right? So the point here is that progress is not a straight line, and we're living that now, right? Like, we are in a moment of severe regression, and I think it's difficult for us to remember things don't just inch forward. Like, often they can take a big step back. But the one, I don't want to call it a positive thing, but let's say interesting thing, that the Hays Code makes possible is queer coding. So it means that people are reading films like Rope, Dracula's Daughter, and sort of like a certain version of the audience is not getting that these are gay characters, but the people in the know get it, right? And so that means that there is a kind of safe harbor in some of these films, right? And if you have ever, sort of enjoyed things like fan fiction or, your own headcanon or whatever, a lot of queer coding led to those similar practices of sort of people being like, okay, it's not explicitly in the text, but I can read it that way. Anyway, Dracula's Daughter is one of my favorites, and it's a great example also because, like, they really did want to make her a lesbian. And you can look back at the production notes and how they're just like severely being repressed to edit and delete all of that out. And so it's sort of interesting to think about how that gets expressed. Cat People, another favorite of mine. So moving forward, let's jump to the 70s. Yeah. Let's go to camp. So throughout the the 30s, 40s, 50s, not only do you have the Hays Code, but in gay politics, one of the big movements was the Mattachine Society. You've got essentially queers arguing for acceptance and tolerance. And the modern version of that would have been arguments for gay marriage. Like, we can be normal just like you, accept us, right? But a certain other trend emerged. It was like, screw that. I don't think I cursed yet. I'm censoring myself so well. I'm well aware we are in the children's room at the library. There were originally curse words on. I'm doing so well. Anyway, but in the 60s and the early 70s, you've got gay liberation, you've got the sexual revolution, and so no longer is it like, oh, we want to be accepted on your terms. It's like, we are going to create new terms, new imaginings of what it means to be in the world. And so I picked these examples because they are such beautiful films that are sort of like, no, I'm not going. And if, in Rocky Horror, we've got this sort of straight-laced, straight people assimilating into this queer, trans, gender-fluid castle, right? And if you've not watched any John Waters, then I need you to leave here right now and watch them all. And I was carefully choosing which gifts from Pink Flamingos, but one of the important things to know is that like queerness has always been understood as pornographic, as obscene, right? That's one of the ways in which it's been censored. And so John Waters especially is somebody who was knowing that his films were going to be shown in porn theaters often, or porn adjacent theaters, and was really embracing the filthiness. One of the things I love here is one of the most vile, stupid, and repulsive films ever made, like a septic tank explosion. And so this is this kind of, if you've ever been confused about what queer camp is, this is it. It's about taking things that are serious and turning them inside out and showing how ridiculous they are. But it's also about taking the ridiculous deeply seriously, profoundly seriously. It's about this kind of carnivalesque inversion. And of course, you can see here, we've also got like gender play and eroticism emerging. Moving forward into the 90s, we've got new queer cinema. So you'll remember I mentioned at the beginning of all of this, queer theories emerging in the late 80s, early 90s in academia and English departments. But of course, this is happening alongside a massive explosion of queer cultural innovation. And so the most important version of it is called New Queer Cinema. Paris is Burning is a part of it, Go Fish, Happy Together. I mean, there are so many others. Isaac Julian's film. One of my favorite examples is, you know it,
Todd Haynes.
Todd Haynes' Superstar, which he shot with Barbies to tell the Karen Carpenter story. It's never been able to be fully released because the Barbie estate won't allow this. That's the Barbie film I want. That's the Barbenheimer I'm waiting for. But it's what's so interesting. It builds on that kind of camp spirit, right? To sort of, okay, we've got Barbies telling this story, but it's also very serious. It's about, a woman suffering from trauma, eating disorders, things like that. And so these films began to really push the boundaries of taking on queerness in its serious and dramatic ways. But also showing minoritized communities that hadn't been. So we've got queer of color critique arising at the same time as a film like Paris is Burning, which is giving a new and broader audience for the drag balls in Harlem. It's so interesting. My students are always like, drag began with RuPaul, right? RuPaul's Drag Race. I'm like, and so we watch Paris is Burning, but we also talk about how Paris is Burning was made by a white lesbian film student, right? Who had been an anthropologist, goes on to go into film school, and makes sort of the drag balls her film project, having no idea it would become a massive cultural touchstone. So that is an interesting film to look at, to think about the tensions between what happens when a minoritized community becomes potentially fetishized. It goes mainstream. It gives a lot more attention to this powerful cultural world, but it also, as many of the performers said, they felt exploited in a way, largely because they didn't get the profits of the film. Go Fish, I think, is interesting also because the writer goes on to make American Psycho. And the director goes on to make The L Word. So New Queer Cinema starts out as highly experimental and independent, but a lot of the filmmakers go on to be relatively mainstream. So this is a really interesting transitional moment in the history of queer cinema. And the most important thing to remember before we move forward is that it's taking place in the shadow of the AIDS crisis, right? So these films are not all by any means melancholic, but it's really important to think about what they're doing in the midst of so many people dying and the kind of devastation of queer social worlds. A lot of these films are thinking about how do you hold community together in a moment that it's being totally decimated and spun apart. So that brings us to the present. And I'm skipping some major texts. You might be like, hey, where's my Brokeback Mountain? I'm not taking it from you. You can still have Brokeback. But part of the reason I didn't want to focus on some of those more conventional Hollywood examples is that many of them were sort of made with the fantasy of a straight audience as the viewer. How can we make these films that will potentially lead to more acceptance, right? This tension between acceptance and change, and refusing the terms. And so we're in a really interesting contemporary moment where, on the one hand, you've got these films moving beyond the tragic story, and I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but sort of an example where queer people didn't die at the end, was somebody, that was Jen, yeah. And so all of contemporary queer and trans cinema, I think, has learned that lesson and is grappling with that. If you've ever wondered why all the queers had to die at the end, just go back to the Hays Code, right? You could have queer people as long as they died at the end, or got married, or went to an insane asylum. But that was less often. So marry or death, that's your options. And so that is why we've got this narrative problem of how do we tell stories where those are not the only endings. But also, I think these films are interesting because they're moving beyond a cisgender and heterosexual-oriented audience. They're imagining making films for their own communities, and so not needing always to translate the terms or the jokes or the inside references. Tangerine is a really interesting example. It was wasn't the first film shot on an iPhone, but it was one of the first, and it's a really interesting experiment in using the iPhone to sort of represent Black trans sex workers in LA. And what I love about it is like it's also a comedy and a Christmas movie. And so like we've got this genre bending that's happening in contemporary queer cinema. Moonlight, I hope if you haven't seen, is like just, I mean, it's one of my favorite films of all time, and it's an incredible example of a coming of age story. But for those of you, if you haven't seen it, the way it structures time is really interesting. So these films are formally experimental. They're building on the energies of new queer cinema, but they're also playful, romantic, comedic. So these two I picked are comedies. If you haven't seen People's Joker, another really, really
It's a
interesting
like
film.
zany masterpiece.
It's
really is.
amazing.
It's so good.
And another film that was, I mean, it wasn't shot on an iPhone, but it was sort of made during COVID on people's desktops, you know?
Yeah.
And so it has a very punk rock kind of energy.
Well, it had like DC or whoever was like on them trying to shut it down the whole time.
Yeah.
And the more they tried to shut it down, the more popularity.
Exactly.
We have that in the collection here too. If anybody's
Oh my God!
Oh, wow.
Oh, please don't
Okay.
watch it.
If it hasn't been stolen, it might.
One of the things I love about The People's Joker is it's trying to tell a transition story in a different way too, and
Yeah.
it uses the Joker story, which many of us are all familiar with, and these kind of cultural examples to, you know, play around with the tropes of, you know, essentially coming out and transitioning, which is often represented. I mean, you mentioned earlier we've got the crime procedural transness, then we've got the like dour Hollywood transness, but also transness played by sort of like straight cis actors, right? Which has been a like really popular version, and so that's something that is interesting about that film in particular, I think. And then Bottom's an incredibly funny, you know, kind of high school comedy. So these films are playing with genre, but it's also like the queerness is sort of like almost beside the point in that film, right?
Yeah.
And do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, I think going into it, I was like, oh, cool. I was like, oh, we're doing like a high school drama. There's happens to be folks that are
Yes.
yeah.
And so shifting that, like, who's the center of the story, is really interesting to me. So those are 4 moments that I think are interesting, but now it's time for you to pitch us a film, because the question I really want to think about is, what is it that you haven't seen? What is it that, I mean, not only, you know, in the course of this very selective history of queer cinema, but also in your own consumption of queer media, television, games, comics, etc. What is it that you have not yet seen that you're dying to see? And I'm open to any of it. It could just be a setting or a situation, but I'm also here if you want to pitch me the film. I forgot to mention I'm very, very rich. Yeah, I just like teach for fun. Yeah, I'm actually like a big shot producer, no big deal. And if your pitch is great, you know, maybe I'll fund it. Anyway, what do you want to see? I'm curious.
I would put, so there was this great show called, what was it? Build Your Own Sex Dungeon?
LOL, bitch.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It was How to Build a Sex Room.
It's
But,
a
okay,
show.
so, that's a funny show, but in that show, this woman, she goes around, she builds, sex rooms. She works with, a poly family. And I was like, I think this might be the first time I've ever seen like a poly family on television. And I was like, I don't think I've ever seen that represented in the same way on film or anything. And this is like, you know, it was a reality show, but I don't really see that.
Oh, that's so
lovely.
cool.
Yeah.
It's like something.
And it wasn't like stigmatized.
Not
right?
at all,
No.
She was just like, oh, now I have a lot more people.
What'd you say?
It's a very
Oh, that's so okay. Now I'm
Well,
just
they have
saying.
little old.
I think so.
You thought it was
I
us?
think yeah, I mean, it's like relationship theory
Yeah, it
as
is. That's
interior
true.
design.
Yeah, I think it's really good.
That's true. That poly family though, they just wanted like the biggest bed.
They just want a big bed.
So they could cuddle. And I was like, that track.
And the shower room too.
Yeah, they wanted it, yeah. With the handle too, so somebody could hang onto it.
And the,
You can see it's slippery in the shower.
Well, yeah,
you know,
sure.
we're gonna get secrets.
That's practical.
I feel like I just do it.
Go ahead.
I feel like for me, like I'd love to see something that just puts the boxes away, and that like the true fluidity is there in terms of like gender, race, like whatever, and just sort of like if there ends up being like romantic interest, it just happens that there's not like, oh, I'm not like we don't go through these tropes and hurdles, like again, fantasy at the moment, but like in this kind of like post-gender, post-sexuality world of like that level of, I don't know, maybe it's a sci-fi film that's named well, something that the Dispossessed or something like that. There's some like concepts in there of like we don't really think about these things anymore. We're just like there's those things aren't like it's gonna happen. Like they're just, this is just the world. Like the afterthought, right?
Yeah.
Of all of it.
I love that point too, and I saw a number of people nodding, so I'd be curious if others want to build on this bit about kind of moving the boxes aside, and then you use the word tropes, right? And it's like, it would be interesting to hear people's, which tropes do you hate the most, or that you would like to retire. But yeah, Allie, what do you think?
Kind of talking like in that, like I want to see the cheesiest, corniest, roll your eyes rom-com with that's like just queer people.
Yeah.
Like I don't want any like, oh, my dad doesn't accept me. Like that's the other thing that I see a lot of, where it's queer pain.
Yes.
Not even necessarily like, oh, they die at the end, but I lost my best friend, my brother doesn't love me anymore. Like I see a lot of that, and it's very painful to also watch. And I want the cheesiest, corniest, joyful, like we can have the Notebook kind of thing, but also like I'm talking like Nicholas Sparks level of disgusting, corny rom-com. And so like that's the kind of thing that I want to see, and I don't want any of those like pain tropes that are like done to death, and I don't necessarily want it. And here's the big thing, that I don't necessarily want it to erase all of that pain and that frustration and things that we live through every single day, but I want something that highlights that corny level of joy.
I'm so glad you opened this question up for us too, because I had a student come to, or they were interested in taking my class, and it was like LGBTQ lit, and they were like, can I meet with you though before I sign up? And I was like, sure. And they were like, is the class just gonna be about the struggle? And I was like, no. I was like, I promise we will watch some fun shit. Like we will, I did Kurt. We will watch some fun stuff. We will play. You know what I mean? But I think that they were feeling a similar thing that you're talking about, where it's like, consuming the pain becomes numbing in a way. And also, why should our pain be the only thing that makes us humanized to an outside world, right?
More than one dimension.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of saying it. Others, what do you want to see? Yeah.
Kind of, I think building on what you were saying, I'd really love to see more media in general, film or otherwise, that, not to say that this should be the only thing, just more, that there should be more of it, where there's just kind of no assumption built into the environment of the media, and characters might feel romantic or intimate with anyone, and it's just kind of like not portrayed as a big deal, whether that ends up being like a straight relationship or a gay relationship or what have you, and kind of just level that playing field almost. Because I feel like even a lot of, at least what I've seen of media that does include like queer characters in various respects, it's kind of a, either it's like focusing on them, or it is intentionally like contrasting them with straight characters. And I just kind of like to see just anyone can love anyone can be anyone sort of stuff more than there is.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like to kind of build off of that too, with like even the other piece of like more media that incorporates like transness and queerness that isn't particularly passing. Like we're using, all sorts of pronouns for all sorts of people that look all sorts of different ways. Like we're all in our own journeys of things, and biology's, I can't swear here.
You can. We'll feel so bad about it.
It's not worth the cost.
I
regret my choice.
Like tweak with that of like how we're using pronouns and how people look, but they're not just associating with the image in your head. I love seeing beautiful trans folks who have made their journey. It's amazing. I love it. Not everybody's done. At the end of the road. Yeah. Hopefully that's all.
No, I love that. I mean, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I also just want to see like more trans characters who are just like random side characters. Because so often it's like either they're the focus or they don't exist.
Yeah.
And like just give me more side characters that just happen to be.
Yeah,
You know?
PCs, that's what you're right.
Yeah.
Or like more Star Trek. Like if you watch like Discovery or Strange New Worlds, it's always like a breath of fresh air that it's like, oh, surprise, that's a queer, this person's pan.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. Like it's not part of the story. It just happens to be more Star Trek.
Yeah, please.
You'll be, oh, my friend this. Oh, my friend this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I was saying, I think it would definitely be nice to see like more like media where the people are queer, but the plot is not about their struggles with that, and it's not like a plot point. It's just like, oh yeah, they can go off and like, I don't know, if it's Star Trek, like discover something. Like, they're just
Discovery.
scientists.
Exactly.
They're just there, or like fighting some other evil or challenge. Like I don't know, like I feel like it would be nice to have like the full like spectrum and like of all the genres of cinema that we have that are just straight by default.
Yeah.
That like why not queer people there too?
Well, I think the straightest genre is action films.
That was another thing.
And so I would love to see, because I keep looking at your tattoo, Sigourney Weaver.
Oh, yes.
Alien 3, right? So that was definitely like a character that I like connected to, because I'm like, there's butch about this person. But I would love to see like a Predator movie where the person fighting or teaming up with the Predator is like a trans person or a non-binary person who's just like, don't cut my head off, but let's go find the whatever. Or like the Rock's and all these like dumb. That I watch all of them. Like it's a fire on the 180th floor and he's got to save somebody. I don't want to see him. I want to see like somebody else like
Reschedules.
whoever. I want to see Katie O'Brien. I want to see somebody who I'm like, oh, this is a very like non-binary hot person. That's what I want. That's what I want. They don't have to be hot. They can just be a person. but I want. I want to see not the cis picture of what you always see in an action movie. I want to see what was that? Twisters. Twisters had some queer characters in it that I was like, I don't need, even though I love that guy, whatever, he's so handsome. But it felt that straight guy was so handsome. But well, I don't think so, and I don't even care if he's whatever. That's his business. But like, I want more queer people in action movies, and I don't want them to be a casualty. There we go. I want them to solve the thing.
Hunter Schafer as Laura Croft.
So this is a non-utopian pitch.
Yeah, give
This
me
is not
that.
what I think should be. This is just what I want, and I'm a weirdo. So it's a biopic that focuses on the early life of Aleister Crowley when he is at Oxford writing bad bisexual poetry, and also a mountain climber. And one of his big pivotal moments as a mountain climber, this is real, is he is on a trek far away, it's snowy, it's very high up, and he realizes that in order to save his companion who has fallen into a crevice, he would significantly risk and almost certainly die himself, and he chooses not to save the person who's on his trip. And I'm like, if we could make this like the moral quandary that turns Aleister Crowley into the baddie that we know he is later, and go from like, I don't know, it's not funny, but it's weird, but I think it could be a fun movie, a murky, weird, early life biopic.
Write this screenplay right now.
And then whoever made The Lighthouse.
I was just saying Robert Eggers.
Yes, yes.
Robert Eggers. The light. Just think of the lighting treatment he's going to give that movie. It's amazing. It would be very fair.
There's something interesting to me too in that example, and I'm thinking too about your point about kind of what is or is not a central plot. One of the things that struck me in the examples that you all gave of text that resonated for you was that often the queerness was, you could call it subtextual or just metaphorical.
Yeah.
It was not explicit or literal. And so I think that that's interesting too, that like there could be queer possibilities in that story. They need not necessarily be explicit one-to-one, right? Or in the Star Trek version, like there are all kinds of queer metaphors in Star Trek. Those are often ones that I resonated far more than like, oh, here's the queer character.
Here's the queer characters, yeah.
But I feel sometimes there is this fear of metaphor, or the fear that the audience won't get it unless we explicitly say. But anyway, that's maybe my thing. But I'm curious, what else do you want to get at?
So, I'm better at knowing what I don't want.
Oh, I love that.
Ooh, and I feel like there are things that do this, but I think I'm tired of seeing the trope of the evil bisexual. And also the mythological bisexual. Like, you know, it's always a vampire, like whatever, some other thing.
You lost me.
I just couldn't.
I was with you and then
A bunch of vampires.
No, I'm kidding.
But like we always see it as like it's not a real human, or they're the bad person, or they're the cheater. And I think I'm like I'm tired. I hate that. So
All bisexuals
I
are
don't.
Yeah.
I mean, a vampire.
I'm doing
And
my
I
thing.
But it is true. I mean, it is a real. I often have students be like, "Where are the good bisexual representations?" And I'm like, "It is tough." And one of the for if you've ever wondered why, like, why is it the bisexuals are the evil characters often? Does anybody know offhand? Not just because of pervasive biphobia. I mean, there's but
Sure, just like a Greek god or demigod or something.
not quite.
Cool.
I mean, maybe there was.
That was a guess.
AIDS.
I don't know if you'll catch that answer.
It's during the AIDS crisis, right? Like, bisexual people become this stigmatized scapegoat because there is this fear that they are going to be the hinge between this group and the wider community. And so this fear of them cheating is also a fear of them transmitting and infecting. Hence, the bisexual vampire is also like a figure of plague. So anyway, yeah, I mean, the biphobia is like so deep, partly because it's not just about one prejudice, but like a few. Anyway, I mean, there's also problems too of like the idea that we can't wrap our brains around like, you know, non-binary, we can't wrap gender fluid, like holding two things at once is difficult. Yeah.
Because I feel like when it comes to movies and television, at least, it's also kind of a thing of they probably struggle to create like a positive portrayal of a bi person without also at some level challenging the assumptions of monogamy.
Right.
And that's what I'm
All of that media is also
Absolutely.
going with that assumption.
Yes, I totally agree. I want to see the poly version, and I want to see the monogamous version
Yeah,
too,
yeah,
and
sure.
both be good.
That's such a great point.
But
Any other, what else you want to see? Or not see. Jen has opened up the, ever want to see again.
Kind of specific, but
I'm here for it.
It'd be nice to see more trans women who love women.
Yes.
Sense8 is an example of that. But it's so starkly straight.
Yeah.
Yes.
By and large.
Yeah.
With the media that does exist. So
It's kind of this thing of like, well, this character fits in this box, so they can't also be in this
Yes,
other
yes,
box.
right.
Yes. We gave you your one thing. Don't get two things. That's a great example.
And I would love to see that sort of stuff too with like actual sex scenes, like actual real, like across the, you know, trans and genderqueer spectrum of that sort of thing of like people aren't just holding hands. You know, and like,
Yeah, I would really like to bring sex back into movies, you know, multiple kinds of sex. I would also like to see more ugly people. Just that's me. I mean, like everybody looks the same airbrushed aesthetic. And one thing I love about older films is like, oh, these people with a range of looks.
So different and non-modern.
Yes,
But
and then you
attractive
discover
in
what.
different ways.
Yeah, you didn't know it could be attractive.
Yeah.
Right, and but to the culture, it's ugly. Anyway, yeah.
Well,
Every body type.
More, yeah, I was just gonna say, different body types. So many, I don't know, we'll watch something and it's hard to discern, like, is this actress?
Yeah.
Or this actor, or this actor, this actor, this actor?
Yep.
Who is this? Unless they have something different,
Yeah.
physical feature, I guess. maybe I'm not.
It's like a forced
No.
facial
They
hair.
all
Yeah.
look the
Yes.
same.
Yes.
They all look the
Yes. I'm
same.
here for this, and
Yes.
let's bring like ableism into the picture as well,
Yes.
and like seeing folks in romantic situations who, you know, they have prosthetics or like different like types of things, and it is also not the plot point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we're not getting back. They just happen to have, you know, a false, you know,
Yeah.
a prosthetic, whatever,
Yeah.
like in any sort of capacity, like that there's something going on, and you just find out when they're being intimate, and you don't make a big deal of it just because like we all have something going on.
Well, I lied. I don't have $1 billion, so I can't film these films. But
Well, we're gonna the crowdsourcing.
I mean, jump
I
on.
do. I have at the end of every semester, I have students make short films, and they're always like, "Oh, I'm not good at this. It's going to be terrible." And then they make incredible things. So I really would encourage you to think about like you should write that screenplay. I'm just saying.
Do it.
You should maybe do it. But to give you homework, because this is basically a class. I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't mention this. So yes, you have
We
homework.
came late.
I have made a list for you of films in case you want to watch some. Oh yeah. Watch some things.
Oh, Mariah.
Pass it down.
Oh, the hunger.
So on the one side, you'll notice is all fiction, and on the other side, documentaries. And I did that in case you wanted to learn a bit more about queer history. Oh, can I look at? I forgot to keep one for myself. Like, what did I put on here? So you'll see here, I tried to organize the list not by identity category, sort of anticipating some of the things that we were talking about, and instead focus more on genres. So Queer for Fear, if you're looking for some horror films, for example, you know, cult classics. I gave you some camp to check out, things like that. But one thing that is, I think, interesting to do is to watch some of them side by side. And so, you know, How to Survive the Plague is, I think, a really important documentary about the AIDS crisis, as well as United in Anger. I think those are the best. If you've never watched either of them, you should. But many of us love The Hunger, which is like, you know, one of the great bisexual vampire films. And it's a film that is like, it was clearly on the filmmakers' minds and the writers' minds, the AIDS crisis, but it's never once mentioned, right? And so something that might be interesting for you is to sort of watch them back to back and sort of think about like what connections aren't explicit, but are nonetheless a part of the story. And what's interesting about How to Survive the Plague is that it's entirely composed of footage shot by AIDS activists at the time. So it's sort of a very interesting, unusual approach for a documentary. A few others I thought I might just point out. If you've never watched Lavender Hill, A Love Story, Lavender Hill was here or just on outside of Ithaca, in Groton, New York. It was like a really important and long-standing gay commune, queer commune here. For like 20 years or something like that, a solid long time. And an incredible, you know, they were like pioneering, you know, kind of organic agriculture, but also they were a space of queer kinship and sort of taking people in who've been, you know, excluded or rejected from their families or their communities. So that's a really powerful one if you're interested in local queer history. And I mean, if you've never seen Paris is Burning, like please watch that. And then the last one I'll mention here, just for documentaries, is Screaming Queens, the riot at Compton's cafeteria. Many people think that the Stonewall riot was sort of like the first and only protest or riot, but the Compton's cafeteria riot was sort of the precursor to Stonewall. And it's an extremely important historical moment for queer resistance in politics. And one of the reasons it's sort of been written out of the story is because it's like primarily Black queer people who were the ones rising up and resisting in that example. Anyway, some documentaries to check out, and then you know, some fiction, fun stuff. You know, good stuff. You know, treat yourself. If you're interested in hearing more of my voice, which probably not after 80 minutes of it, I have a lecture that I gave last month, which is kind of an introduction to queer studies, queer theory, which you can check out at that link, and then my website is there if you want to read academic articles on queer literature. Thanks all for coming out. It's such a pleasure to meet you.
Let's do another 90 minutes.
Now I can
Let's do it.
eat my Sour Patch Kids. I was afraid it would take my voice.